Most people picture Corinth as just another port city in ancient Greece, one more place buried under rubble and Bible verses. The truth is something else entirely. What actually happened inside those walls demanded a capacity for human survival that defied every logic, moral, economic, and physical. This is the story you were never told. Consider what it meant to live in a city whose very name had become synonymous with depravity. Across the entire Greco-Roman world of the first century, there existed a verb that no other place in the empire had ever generated: Corinthiazomai, to Corinthianize. It meant surrendering to a life of sexual and moral excess so extreme that merely invoking the city's name was enough to end any debate about decency. No other metropolis in the Roman Empire carried that linguistic weight. Not Rome, not Alexandria, not Antioch, Corinth. And inside that city, around the year 50 of the Common Era, a man of fragile health, bowed legs, and compromised vision decided to plant a community of faith. What happened there reveals more about human nature than most ancient texts are capable of offering. But before reaching that man, you need to understand what Corinth looked like from the inside. Its streets, its commerce, its temples, and the price every inhabitant paid simply for existing in that place. Corinth did not start out great. It was destroyed and reborn. In 146 before the Common Era, the Roman general Lucius Mummius razed the city to its foundations. He killed the men. He enslaved the women and children. He burned whatever remained. For exactly 100 years, Corinth sat as a silent field of rubble between two seas. An entire century of nothing. Then Julius Caesar, in 44 before the Common Era, decided to rebuild it as a Roman colony, not out of charity, out of pure strategy. Corinth occupied the only strip of land between the Gulf of Corinth to the west and the Saronic Gulf to the east. The isthmus was barely 6 kilometers wide, less than the distance between downtown São Paulo and Congonhas Airport. Any cargo that needed to move from the Adriatic Sea to the Aegean without braving the treacherous route around the Peloponnese, a journey of 320 extra kilometers through dangerous waters, passed through there. Corinth controlled the most valuable commercial bottleneck in the eastern Mediterranean. Caesar populated the new city with a demographic that no urban planner in antiquity would have chosen deliberately. Freedmen, former Roman slaves who had bought or been granted their liberty, landless war veterans, opportunistic traders from every corner of the Mediterranean basin, Jews expelled from other centers, displaced Greeks. Within less than a generation, Corinth had become the capital of the Roman province of Achaia, surpassing Athens in both political and economic importance. Athens had philosophy. Corinth had money. And in the Roman world, money decided hierarchies. Look at the geography of this city, because it explains almost everything. Two ports operated simultaneously. Cenchreae, to the east, received ships from Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. Lycaon, to the west, connected Corinth to Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. Between the two ports, the Greeks had built the Diolkos, a paved trackway cut with limestone grooves along which ships of up to 35 tons were hauled overland on wooden rollers by teams of slaves and oxen. Imagine a vessel the size of an articulated bus being dragged across solid ground for 6 kilometers. The process took between 3 and 5 hours, and it happened multiple times a day. Larger ships could not be transported at all, so their cargo was unloaded at one port, carried overland by cart, and reloaded on the other side. This meant Corinth collected tolls in both directions, twice. From everyone, the volume of wealth flowing through that isthmus defies modern comparison. Strabo, the Greek geographer who visited the region, recorded that Corinth had been called the Wealthy long before its destruction. After the Roman reconstruction, The city multiplied that wealth many times over. Archaeological estimates based on the storage capacity of the harbour warehouses suggest that between 15,000 and 20,000 tons of goods passed through the Corinthian ports annually. Grain from Egypt, wine from Chios, olive oil from Syria, silk from China, arriving via the Silk Road and crossing the Mediterranean in stages, spices from Arabia, marble from Phrygia, slaves from Thrace. Corinth produced almost none of it. She simply charged everyone who needed to pass through. Picture the moment you enter the city along the main road from Lycaon. A paved road 7 meters wide, broader than 2 lanes of a modern highway, cuts through the urban center in a straight line for 400 meters. On either side, marble columns support covered galleries where merchants sell everything from cheap pottery to imported perfumes from the East. The floor is polished limestone slabs. At the center of the city, the agora, the public space that served as market, courthouse, and gathering point, stretches 160 meters long and 90 meters wide, an area equivalent to 2 professional football pitches set side by side. No other agora in Greece was larger, and at the center of that agora stood the bema, an elevated platform of blue and white marble where Roman magistrates administered public justice. That detail matters. Hold on to it. Now follow the daily life of the people who actually lived there. Corinth's population in the mid-1st century is estimated at between 80,000 and 100,000 inhabitants in the urban area, with another 20,000 to 30,000 in the surrounding countryside. For an ancient city, that made it a metropolis. But the distribution of that population reveals Corinth's true character. Roughly 1/3 were slaves. Between 25,000 and 35,000 human beings who did not own their own bodies. They worked the ports, the pottery workshops, the limestone quarries, the kitchens of the wealthy, and the temples. They woke before sunrise. They slept on the ground. They ate what was left over, and they had no life expectancy beyond 40 years. Freedmen, former slaves who had secured some form of liberty, made up another third. This was the class that defined Corinth. Unlike Athens, where the intellectual aristocracy looked down on commerce, in Corinth, money erased origins. A freedman who accumulated enough wealth could hold public office, finance athletic games, and carve his name into marble inscriptions. Archaeology confirms this. In 1929, a team from the American School of Classical Studies in Athens uncovered an inscription in the pavement near Corinth's theatre. It read, in Latin, "Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid this pavement at his own expense." Erastus, the same name cited by Paul in Romans chapter 16, verse 23, where the apostle writes from Corinth and mentions Erastus, the city treasurer. Epigraphy and biblical text intersect on the same stone pavement, but do not be deceived by that social mobility. It had a price. Corinth functioned as a permanent system of exchange where everything, absolutely everything, could be bought. Political favors, judicial decisions, religious access, human bodies. The city operated under a logic the Romans called do ut des, I give so that you give. No relationship was free, no gesture was disinterested. Even religion followed this economy. Look closely at what happened on the Acrocorinth. The hill that dominated the city to the south rose 575 meters above sea level, higher than the Empire State Building, and on its summit stood the Temple of Aphrodite. Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, claimed the temple housed more than 1,000 sacred servants, slave women dedicated to ritual prostitution. That number is disputed among modern historians. Some argue that Strabo was describing pre-destruction Corinth, not the rebuilt city. Excavations on the summit of the Acrocorinth have revealed that the Roman temple of Aphrodite was relatively modest. a structure 10 meters by 16 meters, smaller than a tennis court, making the simultaneous presence of 1,000 people implausible. What is not disputed is that sacred prostitution existed as a genuine religious practice, and that Corinth was its epicenter in the Roman world. At street level, prostitution required no temples. It happened in taverns, in rooms above the agora's shops, in rented quarters near the ports, and in the side streets after dark. Excavations in residential areas have turned up large quantities of ceramic lamps bearing explicit erotic imagery, an archaeological indicator that commercial sexual activity permeated ordinary urban life. The playwright Aristophanes, centuries earlier, had already used Corinth as a standard backdrop for jokes about prostitution. In Roman Corinth, the practice had simply become professionalized. Consider the sanitary challenge of living in that environment. Corinth had a water system that was remarkable for antiquity. The Pyrene fountain, carved into the living rock at the city's center, supplied fresh water through a system of underground chambers and distribution channels. A second source, the Glauc fountain, supplemented the supply, but the sewage system was rudimentary. Waste was discharged into open trenches running along the sides of streets until reaching larger channels directed out of the city. In dry seasons, and the Mediterranean climate produced at least 4 months of intense drought per year, those channels dried up. The smell became unbearable. Gastrointestinal diseases were endemic. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and parasitic infections hit slaves and port workers especially hard, since they had no access to the clean water of the public fountains reserved for the upper classes. And it was not only the health. Dock work in Corinth was brutal in ways that few ancient texts describe honestly. The stevedores, predominantly slaves and the poorest free laborers, carried ceramic amphorae weighing between 25 and 30 kilograms each when full, the weight of a newborn calf, repeatedly, over shifts of 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. Unloading a single medium-sized merchant vessel involved moving 300 to 500 amphorae. Lumbar injuries were so common that skeletons found in port area cemeteries from the period show advanced vertebral degeneration in individuals in their 30s. 30 years old. The age at which a modern worker is just starting a career was the age at which a Corinthian dock worker already had the body of an old man. Enslaved women faced an additional layer of brutality. Beyond the domestic labor that began before dawn and ended after the master's dinner, they had no legal protection against sexual abuse by their owners. Roman law was explicit. The body of the slave belonged to the owner, without exception, without recourse. Children born to enslaved women were automatically the property of the master, regardless of who the father was. The Roman historian Seneca, a contemporary of Paul, recorded that mortality among urban slaves was so high that slave markets required constant restocking, an observation that transforms statistics into horror when applied to a city the size of Corinth. And it was in this city that the Isthmian Games took place every 2 years. Think about what that meant. The Games were the second most important athletic event in the Greek world, surpassed only by the Olympics, held at the sanctuary of Poseidon in Isthmia, 11 kilometers east of Corinth. They drew between 20,000 and 40,000 visitors over 2 weeks. Athletes from across the Mediterranean competed in running, wrestling, boxing, pancration, a brutal combination of wrestling and boxing with almost no rules, and horse racing. Winners received crowns of dried pine, not laurel, as at the Olympics, but the real prize was prestige. And in Corinth, prestige converted immediately into patronage and wealth. Paul knew these games. He wrote about them. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, he uses the metaphor of the athlete competing for a perishable crown, comparing it to the imperishable crown of faith. That was not an abstract metaphor. Paul wrote those words for people who had watched or heard about the Isthmian Games. They knew the sweat, the restrictive diet of 10 months of mandatory training, the pain of boxers whose hands were wrapped in hardened strips of leather. The image was concrete, visceral. Now follow Paul's arrival in Corinth. According to the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, verses 1 to 4, Paul arrived alone, coming from Athens, where his preaching on the Areopagus had produced modest results. He found a Jewish couple, Aquila and Priscilla, who had been expelled from Rome by the decree of Emperor Claudius, who banned Jews from the capital around the year 49. The Roman historian Suetonius recorded that decree, mentioning disturbances among Jews at the instigation of Chrestus, a likely garbled reference to disputes about Christ in the Roman synagogues. Aquila and Priscilla were tent makers. Paul practiced the same trade. He lodged with them and worked during the week, cutting, sewing, and waterproofing silicium, a coarse material made from goat hair named after Cilicia, Paul's home province. Calculate what that manual labor actually meant. Silicium was one of the most punishing materials a craftsman could work with. The goat hair fibers caused constant abrasions to the skin. After months of the work, the hands developed calluses so thick that sensitivity in the fingers diminished permanently. Paul worked at this trade 6 days a week, probably from 6 in the morning until midday, when the Mediterranean heat made any physical labor unsustainable. Then, in the afternoons and evenings, he went to the synagogue on Sabbaths and during the week spoke in workshops, squares, and public spaces with anyone willing to listen. He did not choose Corinth by accident. The city was a crossroads. Everything passed through it: goods, people, ideas, religions. A convert in Corinth could carry the message to Ephesus on the next ship. Another could return to Rome. Another could sail on to Alexandria. Corinth was a natural multiplier. But that also meant Paul was competing for the attention of people who had already heard everything. The cult of Isis, the mysteries of Dionysus, devotion to Asclepius, the god of healing, whose temple in Corinth received ceramic offerings in the shape of diseased body parts, votive requests for cure that archaeologists have recovered by the thousands, Mithras, Cybele, and of course, the imperial cult of the emperor himself. Then came the first major conflict. The Jewish community of Corinth rejected Paul. Acts chapter 18 verse 6 records that they opposed and reviled him. Paul shook out his garments, a Jewish gesture of formal rupture, and declared that from that point forward he would go to the Gentiles. He moved into the house of Titius Justus, a God-fearing Gentile whose residence stood directly next to the synagogue. The geographical provocation was deliberate, wall to wall. And then something unexpected happened. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, the man of highest Jewish religious authority in Corinth, converted along with his entire household. The irony was cutting. The leader of the institution that had rejected Paul became his most prominent convert. The community Paul founded in Corinth was radically different from any other social structure the city had ever produced. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 to 28, Paul reminded the group of its own composition: not many wise by worldly standards, not many powerful, not many of noble birth. The majority were manual laborers, small craftsmen, freedmen and slaves, people who in the Roman system would never have sat in the same room together. The slave and his master, the Jew and the Gentile, the educated Greek and the illiterate barbarian, the woman and the free man. Paul placed them at the same table, literally. The communal meal was the central act of their gathering, and it was precisely there that the problems began. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 21 and 22, reveals that the wealthier members were arriving early to the meetings, held in private homes, most likely in the residence of Gaius, mentioned in Romans 16, verse 23, and eating and drinking before the workers and slaves finished their shifts. By the time the poorer members arrived, the food was gone. The rich were satisfied. Some were drunk. The contrast was brutal. In a community that preached equality before God, the table reproduced exactly the hierarchy that existed outside. The economic division was not enough. The intellectual division was equally destructive. Corinth was a city that valued rhetoric above almost everything else. The skilled orator was a celebrity, and the Corinthians began treating their spiritual leaders like competing public speakers. I belong to Paul. I belong to Apollos. I belong to Cephas. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12. The community splintered into factions that functioned exactly like Roman political parties. Personal loyalties built on charisma, not on substance. Apollos was eloquent, trained in the Alexandrian tradition. Paul was, by his own admission in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 10, weak in bodily presence and contemptible in speech. The city that measured human worth by performative ability was measuring its spiritual leaders by the same standard. And then came the problem that defined Corinth more than any other. Sexuality. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 to 5 records a case that shocked even Paul. A member of the community was maintaining a sexual relationship with his father's wife, most likely a stepmother. Paul noted that this was something not even tolerated among the Gentiles. The phrasing is significant. In a city where sacred prostitution was a religious practice and sexual immorality was so normalized that it had generated its own verb, this case exceeded even Corinthian limits. Paul's response to that situation reveals the full scale of the challenge. He could not simply impose Jewish moral rules on Gentile converts who had grown up inside an entirely different system. For a Corinthian Gentile, visiting a prostitute in the temple of Aphrodite was a religious act, not an immoral one. Purchasing sex near the port was as routine as buying bread. Athletic nudity at the Isthmian Games was a celebration of the body, not a cause for shame. Paul had to construct an entirely new ethics for people who had none of the moral reference points he considered obvious. Every paragraph of 1 Corinthians is a response to a specific question raised by a community lost between two worlds, the world they knew and the world Paul was presenting to them. Consider the physical setting of those domestic meetings. Roman houses in Corinth followed an architectural pattern that archaeology has mapped with precision. The residence of a moderately prosperous member, someone like Gaius, would have had a triclinium, the formal dining room with space for at most 9 people reclining. Beyond that lay the atrium, the central open space, which could accommodate perhaps 30 to 40 more, seated on the floor or standing. A community of 50 to 70 members, a reasonable estimate for the Corinthian church, meant that not everyone fit in the same room. The most important were placed in the triclinium, with better food and wine mixed in more generous proportions. The rest stayed in the atrium, with whatever remained. The physical architecture of the Roman house reproduced the very social hierarchy Paul was trying to dismantle. The walls pushed back. The pressure on Paul during the 18 months he remained in Corinth was relentless. Acts chapter 18 verses 9 and 10 records that God himself intervened in a night vision, telling Paul not to fear and to keep speaking, because I have many people in this city. The very need for that intervention suggests Paul was at his limit. Physically worn down by manual labor, emotionally exhausted by the community's internal conflicts, socially marginalized as a craftsman in a city that despised manual work among its leaders. Then came the legal test. The Jews of Corinth hauled Paul before Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia, accusing him of persuading people to worship God in a manner contrary to the law. Acts chapter 18, verses 12 to 17. Gallio was the brother of the philosopher Seneca and one of the most sophisticated administrators in the empire. He heard the accusation and dismissed it without even allowing Paul to speak in his own defense. To Gallio, this was an internal Jewish dispute, not a Roman crime. He sent everyone away. The decision appears simple, but its consequences were enormous. By refusing to condemn Paul, Gallio established an administrative precedent. Christian preaching did not violate Roman law. That precedent protected the Pauline communities for years. And it happened on the Bema, that raised platform of blue and white marble at the center of the agora that you held in memory. The Gallio inscription, found at Delphi in 1905, is one of the few absolute chronological anchors in the entire New Testament. It confirms that Gallio served as proconsul of Achaia between the years 51 and 52 of the Common Era. This means Paul was in Corinth from approximately the end of 49 to the middle of 51. That is not theological estimation. It is Roman epigraphy cross-referenced with biblical text, stone confirming papyrus, but the hardest work had not even begun. Paul left Corinth and the community was left alone, and alone it slowly collapsed under the weight of its own city. The two letters that survived, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, are in reality fragments of at least 4 distinct letters Paul sent over 5 to 6 years. One of them, the tearful letter mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, was written with such anguish that Paul admitted composing it with many tears. That letter is lost, or perhaps fragments of it are preserved within 2 Corinthians. Scholars have debated the question for centuries. Each letter responded to specific crises, divisions over leadership, lawsuits between community members filed in pagan courts, confusion about marriage and celibacy, disputes over eating meat sacrificed to idols, a problem that only makes sense when you understand that most of the meat sold in Corinth's markets passed first through pagan temples as an offering, and whatever remained was resold in the adjacent shops. To buy meat in Corinth meant almost inevitably buying meat that had been offered to a pagan god. For a convert from Judaism, that was an abomination. For a Gentile convert, it was lunch. Paul also faced rivals. Other preachers arrived in Corinth after his departure, bringing different messages. Some demanded circumcision, others promised superior wisdom. Others came carrying letters of recommendation from other communities, something Paul did not have and refused to use. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 27, Paul responded with a catalogue of sufferings that functioned as his only credential. 5 times he received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was stoned. 3 times he was shipwrecked. He spent a night and a day adrift in the open sea. Hunger, thirst, cold, nakedness. That was not rhetorical flourish. It was an inventory of scars. The reality of Corinth's streets remained indifferent to all of it. Ships arrived and departed. Stevedores broke their spines hauling amphorae. Temple slaves served anonymous clients. Freedmen accumulated money and carved their names into marble to prove they existed. The games came around every 2 years. The smell of the port, salted fish, wet timber, human sweat, and temple incense never changed. The city did not pause for a new religion. The city never paused for anything. The common worker in Corinth ate barley porridge, olives, dried figs, and occasionally salted fish from the Saronic Gulf. Meat was a luxury reserved for religious festivals when the leftovers from sacrifices were distributed, or for those who could pay. A dock worker's daily caloric intake fell between 1,800 and 2,200 calories, insufficient for the energy demands of his shift. Chronic malnutrition produced vulnerability to infections that, without antibiotics or any understanding of microbiology, frequently became fatal. Malaria, transmitted by mosquitoes that bred in the marshes surrounding the isthmus, was endemic. Skeletons from the period found in the region show signs of chronic anemia consistent with repeated malarial infection. The price of living in Corinth was paid in bone. Children paid a particular price. Infant mortality across the Roman Empire ran at roughly 25 to 30% before the first year of life. In port cities like Corinth, with worse sanitation and higher population density, that rate was almost certainly higher. 1 in every 3 or 4 children born in Corinth did not survive 12 months. Those who survived faced early weaning, between 6 months and 1 year, and a transition to solid food poor in protein. Rickets and malnutrition left marks on teeth and bones that modern paleopathology can read like a biological diary of suffering. And it was for these people, dock workers with shattered spines, enslaved women with no autonomy over their own bodies, freedmen desperate to erase the memory of bondage, mothers who lost children before their first birthday, that Paul wrote the most celebrated words about love ever set down in Western literature. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Love is patient. Love is kind. Those words were not written in a philosophical garden in Athens. They were written for people who lived in the most impatient and most cruel place in the Mediterranean. The distance between the text and the context is precisely what makes those words brutally honest. Paul was not describing what those people already lived. He was describing exactly what they lacked. Weeks, months, and years passed. Paul never returned to live in Corinth, though he visited the city at least once more. The community survived, not without crises, not without fractures. In 96 of the Common Era, nearly 50 years after its founding, Clement of Rome wrote a letter to the Corinthian community reproving it for a fresh wave of internal divisions. The same divisions, the same disputes over prestige and leadership. The city shaped its inhabitants with more force than any apostolic letter could counter. The ruins of Corinth are still there today. 7 kilometers southwest of the modern city, the Doric columns of the Temple of Apollo, 7 of them still standing, erected around 540 before the Common Era, dominate the archaeological site. The bema has been excavated and identified. The Erastus inscription remains visible in the pavement. The Pyrene and Glaus fountains still hold water in their stone chambers. The Acra Corinth rises in the background, silent, with no temple on its summit. The stones that once supported the sanctuary of Aphrodite were dismantled and reused in medieval fortifications. What endured from Corinth was not the marble, not the commerce, not the games, not the money that once flowed through 2 ports. None of that survived. What endured was 29 chapters distributed across 2 letters, written by a tent maker with calloused hands and failing eyesight, addressed to slaves, prostitutes, dock workers, and small traders in a city the entire world knew by its vice. Those words were copied, translated, read aloud, memorized, and transmitted for 2 millennia. The temples fell, the letters remained. And perhaps what Corinth teaches, more than any other place in the ancient world, is that the most enduring transformation never begins where everything is in order. It begins exactly where everything appears to be lost.